Thank you all for joining us. I'm Liz Dávid-Barrett. I'm the Director of the Centre for the Study of Corruption at the University of Sussex. I'm really pleased that everyone has come along today to hear about and talk about what has happened in the 5 years now since the London Anti-Corruption Summit. The summit was quite a remarkable event at the time. It was outside the agenda of most multilateral summits like the G7 and G20. And it was really dedicated to this one topic of corruption, partly because the UK Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, had recognised that trends in kleptocracy and illicit financial flows were not localised or technical problems, but they were really core to global security and stability. It was a golden moment, really, when the world seemed to be coming together to take the issue of corruption seriously. But Britain's leadership did not continue. The referendum on EU membership came along the following month, and from then on took up a huge amount of government time and energy. And of course, on top of that, in the last year, the pandemic has occupied the international agenda. But this is a good time to be talking about this because there are now some glimmerings of international leadership again. At the beginning of June, the UN General Assembly will hold its first ever special session on corruption. So perhaps a good time to be debating what we have achieved, but also what comes next. And in today's session, we're going to hear from 4 excellent speakers who have all played quite different but critical roles in the summit 5 years ago. I'm going to introduce them all in a moment. And then the format will be that we'll have short interventions from each of them over the next half an hour. And after those opening remarks, we'll have some discussion among the panel and we'll open up to questions from the audience. So do please start thinking about your questions. So the speakers we have today, first of all, we have Creon Butler. Creon is the Research Director for Trade, Investment and New Governance Models and Director of the Global Economy and Finance Programme at Chatham House, an international affairs think tank in the UK. At the time of the summit, he was at the Cabinet Office and he was responsible for designing and organising the UK's Global Anti-Corruption Summit 5 years ago this month. Next up, we have Jameela Raymond. Jameela is currently a cause strategist at the B team. She leads the organisation's work on cleaning up public procurement and advancing efforts to end anonymous company ownership. But at the time of the summit, Jameela was working for Transparency International UK, where she led the team working on the summit, and then afterwards also created its system, Chayes system, for tracking the progress of all those commitments that were made at the summit. Next, we have Robert Barrington. Robert is my colleague now. He's a professor of anti-corruption practice at the Centre for the Study of Corruption here at the University of Sussex. Previously, though, at the time of the summit, he was the head of Transparency International UK, and hence also a key interlocutor with the government, helping to shape the agenda of the summit and make sure that it was really impactful. And then finally, we have Sarah Chayes. Sarah is an accomplished author and analyst of international affairs. In particular, her recent book is about corruption in America, and particularly under the Trump administration. But part of the thinking for the London Anti-Corruption Summit was shaped by her previous book, which was called Thieves of State: Why Corruption Threatens Global Security. So I think you'll agree we've got some fantastic speakers, and I will now hand over to them. So over to you, Creon.
So it's not a case of ending up with one set that everybody agreed to. You can choose your ideas, and this actually turned out to be really quite powerful because some countries actually just went down the list and said we're going to choose these things. Others could fit it in many different ways to what they were already doing. And I think that was one of the reasons that we ended up with a lot of content at the end. The other reason was that because there was no set membership, we could afford to lose people. And I had a pre-agreed list with number 10 of those countries we could afford to lose in the process. But in the end, we actually lost very few because of the way the structure worked, that everybody was able to do something quite substantial. Another, and just the final point on the process is, it was crucial how we were able to work with our posts, because the process was changing as we went along, the ideas were changing. And so we kept sending them in and saying, look, you've got to explain what we're doing now. Make sure they're on board for it, explain to them how this is a list they can now choose from, and so on. And that was actually quite crucial. Next point, just on the legacy. I mean, I think the really crucial thing was that while we were building the summit, we were thinking quite a lot about the summit, the legacy. So at the same time as doing the summit, I was also co-chair of the G20 Anti-Corruption Summit, or the Anti-Corruption Working Group with China. And we were also working very closely with the G7. So all the way along, we were sort of plugging these ideas into other processes. Then, of course, we had the referendum, the Prime Minister resigned, and we lost the most crucial element normally in follow through, both in terms of the national system and the international space. And while Theresa May, you know, she didn't have any problem with fighting corruption, she had other priorities. And so this wasn't right at the top of the list in the way it had been for David Cameron. But some of the elements, I think, had a sort of created our own momentum. You know, the fighting corruption in sport was one example of a process that started and then kept going. And it was quite interesting because that was actually one thing we lost in the declaration, because the IOC at the end of the day just couldn't do what we had hoped they would do in terms of the statement. But actually the process kept going afterwards, and as I understand, has proved quite helpful, quite successful. Final point I just want to make on today's environment. I mean, obviously things have changed considerably, and I'm sure my sort of co-panelists will talk about this more. Populist politicians criticize corruption, and that's part of their process for getting elected, but they don't necessarily then want to fight it very hard afterwards. And you can see that in a whole range of different examples. There are reasons why that would be the case, but I think one of the consequences of populism generally is that there are quite a number of countries who were previously strongly behind this who aren't now. In terms of new issues, we have really three, I think, that are really crucial. The risk of corruption in climate finance. If we don't, you know, get on top of that, there's a real risk that this could undermine a really important element of the low carbon transition. The role of new technology, both as a potential facilitator of corruption, but also as a potential tool to fight it. So you have Bitcoin can be a way of moving funds, but blockchain can be a way of combating corruption. And then finally, COVID, and my colleagues may want to talk a bit about COVID, but just the truly enormous amounts of public expenditure and the speed with which it's had to happen. So I think the challenge really is, how do you do these things while also tackling the big agenda on fighting corruption from before? And then one very final point really is on the way corruption is going to fit into our world of some degree of decoupling between the West and particularly China. Is corruption going to be a bridge issue, one of those issues that we fight together because we both have a strong interest in doing it, as it did feel to be in 2016? Or is it going to be something that's clearly on the Western side and not on the China side? So let me stop there.
That's great. Thanks very much, Creon, and fantastic timekeeping too. So next up is Jameela.
Thanks, Liz, and thank you, Creon, for that scene setting. I'm going to try and give the civil society version, which I hope will be slightly aligned at least, and I'll try and stick to time, Liz. So as mentioned before, I was part of the Transparency International UK team that was coordinating UK and global civil society efforts around the Anti-Corruption Summit. And the first thing that I'd reiterate, already been said, but just important note, is that the scene we were working in really did feel like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to catalyse progress in tackling corruption. We had a Prime Minister with a clear personal commitment to the anti-corruption agenda. And yes, we were focusing on the summit's legacy, but we also knew it was part of what he wanted as his legacy, which was a really important factor in why we were able to get so much done in a short amount of time. We had the FIFA corruption scandal through 2015, the Panama Papers leak in 2016, and then even 2 days before the summit, the Prime Minister made that slightly awkward statement about fantastically corrupt leaders coming to England in a couple of days. And so for good and bad reasons, I think that by the time the summit came round, we had international eyes on anti-corruption and on the UK and on the summit. So from the civil society side, this was perfect. You know, we've been working for months to really try and drive ambition, show that we were optimistic about this opportunity and do whatever we could to make it as rich and robust as possible. Some things we did from TI UK at the time in partnership with the global community. For about 6 months before the summit, we collected over 100 game-changing policy proposals as part of this big ideas database that Creon alluded to. We sifted through that and presented the best of those ideas to the government as the real transformative actions that governments could commit to as part of that menu of options and really, you know, take the summit to the next level. The day before the summit, we held a conference with about 7 partners from business and civil society called Tackling Corruption Together. And the ambition for that was to really set a standard of how we as civil society thought the summit could be run. Really show that it was a shared agenda between civil society, business, government, media, all sorts of different actors, and just show that you know, it was possible to do this openly, transparently, accessibly for lots of different people. The last thing that I'd say we did, not the last, but the final thing I'll mention, is that we didn't want it to just be a photo opportunity. We really wanted it to make sure that leaders were on a stage, yes, making statements, but statements that were commitments that were beyond things that had already been said, not just reiterating things from old fora, but really setting new ambition, bringing fresh ideas to the table. We wanted it to be multi-stakeholder and not take place behind closed doors. And I think we actually got a lot of those things happening. So for us, the immediate aftermath of the summit, we said it was a success, a good day in the fight against corruption, I believe is Robert's exact language. But I think we can all agree that the success of a commitment-making summit does depend on the strength of those commitments and how they're implemented, which is what we at TI UK did in the years after. In our immediate assessment, we did find that about half of the 600 commitments made at the summit were concrete, which was many more than I think we anticipated. A third were ambitious and a third were new. So we were in a strong position May 13th, 2016, let's say. We were very excited about what was in front of us. But with a bit of distance, I guess 5 years is a great time to kind of pause and reflect and think, did it really go as far as it could have done? I think that the impact and the success of it, we can see slightly differently now. So I'm going to dig into about 3 different parts of the communique, which stand out for me as, you know, if they had been taken a bit more seriously, a bit more robustly, what would that mean for the world today? But I will just flag that the team at Transparency International UK has still been tracking those commitments, and all of that information is online if anybody's interested in checking that out. So the 3 things that I'll bring up. The first is the communique spoke about protecting whistleblowers and journalists, and very specifically spoke about the role of the media, including civil society, business, and investigative journalists in tackling corruption as like partners within our ecosystem. About 18 months after the summit, unfortunately, a Maltese journalist was assassinated in a car bomb. Malta was one of those governments that was at the summit, and she had been spending years investigating corruption within that exact government. Outside of Malta and kind of across the world, press freedom has deteriorated in the last 5 years. And I just think that there's more that the international community could have done to really take that commitment seriously and really protect that vital part of our, you know, whistleblowing accountability ecosystem. So that's one point I just wanted to flag. The second, I think that public contracts is part of our, you know, international conversation more than ever before. And the communique back 5 years ago did say that public procurement would be open by default, at least in those 40 or so countries, and that public contracts would be awarded and managed openly, accountably, and fairly. 13 governments went one step further and built in specific commitments into their individual plans, and 4 specifically said they do that with health procurement. Now, after a year like what we've just had, I think it's quite interesting to think, even at that high level, if those 40 governments, just those 40, had actually implemented those open, fair, accountable public procurement systems, even 3 years after the summit, how differently would COVID have played out? And what does that mean in terms of lives saved, money saved, time saved? You can't really help but wonder about that. The third thing I'd mention from the communique is that although many things were taken seriously, implemented well, and I think there's lots that we can talk about on the positive side, I just want to flag that a lot of commitments that were made that had potential kind of ended up lacking substance, and that was a real disappointment. A couple of anecdotes. We had some examples of delegates making commitments at the summit that just were not communicated back to the departments, teams, individuals that were responsible in delivering them, which just is a huge gap in getting anything done. And in following up, we would find out about these gaps years later, and that was just a real struggle. other commitments were made, big shiny initiatives were announced, and that's really brilliant. But then, once the dust settles, governments would silently say, oh, we didn't really think that this really had a compelling case to bother getting it done. And so, again, can't help but wonder, wouldn't it have been great if prior to turning up to the summit and printing pages and pages and pages of commitments, which I personally counted, wouldn't it have been great if the research had been done ahead of time to see who is in charge of doing this? Do they have the resources? Is it feasible? Will it have the impact we want before turning up and doing these kind of buzzword statements that I think just let everybody down? Just to echo a point that Creon made, David Cameron did resign 2 months after the summit, and I think that since then, anti-corruption, at least in the UK, has felt like it's become less important to those in power. And actually, these corruption scandals are now so frequently part of our news cycle. I personally find it hard to keep up with so many of them. And I think this is the challenge with having it rooted in one individual's passion, as a passion project for one person or a small group of people, rather than it being properly institutionalized and taken seriously and understood across politics and across the country. So my kind of summary of the summit and its impact is that I think it was an important moment for us as a close-knit community, and there were absolutely implemented commitments which have changed the corruption landscape in certain countries, in certain spaces. But ultimately, I worry that we squandered some of the opportunities that were presented and maybe didn't make the most of this golden moment that we had. Thank you.
Thanks, Jameela. Quite sobering there at the end. Robert, what's your take?
Thank you, Liz. I think the first thing to say is that the expectations were very high from civil society going into the summit. I remember this really dated from the year before when Cameron was re-elected in 2015, and very quickly after that we got a call at TI from Number 10 asking for contributions to a speech he was going to make in Singapore. We gave our biggest and best ideas, and lo and behold, lots of them were in that speech. And that was the speech that announced the summit would take place the next year. So from that point on, we had a very, very close communication with Number 10, probably the closest you will ever get from an NGO working with the top of government. We had a TI board meeting in which we talked about this literally being a once in a generation opportunity and the need to allocate staff and resources at very short notice to doing this. So we put together the summit team, which included Jameela and a couple of other people, and got going. And as we went further in the process, we found not that there was a diminishing hunger for ideas, but an increasing hunger for ideas. So we approached May the 12th, 2016 with a huge sense of expectation. And that was broadly fulfilled at the summit itself, I think, that the global chair of TI at the time, Jose Ugas, was interviewed on the BBC News at 10 and asked how he would rate it as a summit, and he said he would give it 8 out of 10 on the day, and the test would be how much happened in the years to come, and how prescient that turned out to be. The commitments were, of course, very impressive. It was a very large number, and in fact, the UK commitments were both impressive in number, but also a lot of them were followed through on. If I think of unexplained wealth orders, the push on open contracting in the UK, the global beneficial ownership transparency campaign, the pressure that has now resulted in the overseas territories and crown dependencies moving on beneficial ownership, and of course the UK having its first ever anti-corruption strategy with a clear focus on domestic corruption, not just international corruption. All that came out of the summit, the conversations we had in the lead up, and the summit communique. So, you know, I think broadly, high expectations, and on the day, expectations fulfilled, and indeed subsequently, some of that stuff happened, in the UK at least. It's also worthwhile thinking how significant this was in the sort of 30-year perspective of the anti-corruption movement. There was definitely a feeling I picked up from the British government that the global anti-corruption process had got sort of bogged down in the last 2 years leading up to 2016, and part of the purpose of this summit was to do something else, to in a sense bypass processes like UNCAC, where you would get governments that were serial blockers of forward movement. So this was a chance to get around the table countries that did want to do something, would commit to doing something. So, you know, I think in the long perspective, it was pretty significant because it showed that you can have a global anti-corruption moment, possibly even a process, which doesn't have to be mired in a UN process. And that, I think, was important. Of course, there are dangers about that. You don't want necessarily unilateral processes outside the formal processes. On the other hand, you can get movement. And I think it was important to see that. It also showed very much, you know, the maturing of civil society in that period, that civil society, I felt, was a pretty much equal partner with government on a lot of this, in a number of ways, partly putting pressure on home governments to attend to the summit and sign up to stretching targets, partly keeping the issue topical on the agenda. You know, I remember when the Panama Papers broke, what a great thing it was, but also remember what a huge role civil society and the media played in getting that to wide public attention, doing a good analysis and so on. But I suppose fundamentally what I felt is there could be a real alignment between civil society and government in terms of interests on tackling corruption if the political will exists. And I think, you know, there have been occasional moments of that in that 30-year anti-corruption history. And this was one of them. Another might be, for example, the passing of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. They're few and far between, but it really demonstrated that civil society and government, you know, can work hand in hand if the stars are aligned. I guess also, as Jameela and Creon have both alluded to, it was very clear that summit design really contributes to the success of these things. And I think there's a big lesson there for the forthcoming US Summit for Democracy, which is promised for sometime in the next few months. I mean, this was participatory, that civil society was fully there in the room with business and government. Doesn't happen all that often. It was very transparent. It was live streamed. We had very good access to the process beforehand. The only bit when we were really shut out was when the summit communique was being negotiated in its final days. And the communique went beyond bland sort of statements into very specific country commitments. So, you know, all of that around the summit design was very important. And I think, again, just looking at the 30-year history, it's worthwhile thinking what would the world have looked like without that anti-corruption summit. And the reason that's important is because when you wake up on the morning of May the 13th, your vision is something like this. Wow, we've had this amazingly successful summit. David Cameron's likely to be in power for another 3.5 years. Hillary Clinton and the Democrats are going to be in power in the US. The World Bank and the IMF are vying for who's going to lead on taking forward this issue of corruption. Isn't the world a golden place? And within a very short time, all of that had changed. So as a result of that significant political change, it's easy to imagine the summit was a bit useless, frankly, you know, maybe just a flash in the pan, a high watermark and nothing more. But in fact, it was a high watermark, I think, in terms of participation and commitments and thinking about how to stretch out this global anti-corruption agenda. But although it was a high watermark, it came at a critical moment when lots of momentum had been lost in the standard anti-corruption processes. And for me, the sort of lasting legacy at the moment is that it created forward momentum on lots of stuff, which hasn't entirely been lost. Some of it, I think, because of the political changes, has been stalled, but I don't think it's been definitively finished. And I think if you look at those advances in the UK, things like the unexplained wealth orders, the beneficial ownership transparency campaign, and so on, if you look at the global sort of movement, the traction towards open contracting, I think a lot of this can be ascribed in part to the momentum created by the summit. So I guess, you know, I'm left feeling the summit certainly didn't achieve all it could have done. I think it's done a lot better than, the world is a lot better off than it would have been without the summit. And I also think it's not too late for renewed political leadership to take forward this agenda in a more substantive way. Though at the moment, I think there's a big question mark about where and whether that political leadership will come. And for me, all eyes are on the Summit for Democracy as one of the next moments, as well as UNGAS, though I don't hold out a huge amount of hope for UNGAS, because that is part of that UN process that the 2016 summit was itself saying is not all that dynamic. All right, back to you, Liz.
Thank you very much, Robert. And next we have Sarah. Sarah, I think you're on mute at the moment.
There we are.
Perfect.
Sorry. So I was saying thank you and thanks for organizing this. It is a lovely moment to just take a second to look back and take stock. And now I sort of regret being the last speaker because I'm afraid that I may have a glummer view of the ultimate outcome than we've heard so far. So let me just begin by saying I really subscribe, you know, I mean, Robert being last, but I really subscribe to that kind of dual view of the outcome of this. But let me just throw some light on the shadow, if I may. And I came at this from the perspective, you know, civil society, but not organized civil society. So I wasn't a part of any organization that was working on this. I was sort of coming into it from the field and from the perspective initially of the developing world, but particularly of the crises that arise in reaction to systemic corruption, specifically violent extremism, but I mean, you name it, right? You know, mass migration, ecological collapse, extreme voting, you know? And so I was seeing almost every major international security crisis as having corruption at its root. And therefore, this thing is not a niche subject, right? The way it was sometimes treated in the UN context and whatnot. And yet that was still what I was receiving, is that this was a back burner subject. So along comes this summit. I mean, I was absolutely thrilled, you know, very similar to the reaction Robert and Jameela are describing. It was the first time this thing had been given attention at that level. And so it was a high. I mean, there's no question we were a bit giddy. I was certainly felt a bit giddy. But I would also say that, again, from a personal perspective, I was already realizing that corruption, meaning serious systemic corruption, was not just a developing world phenomenon. We were on the spectrum. And as Robert has pointed out, the summit did address that to some extent, and there have been some changes. But I would say that overall, in retrospect, and though it was as ambitious and as much of a high water mark as I really do believe it was, it almost seems ludicrously insufficient to the moment that was at hand. And there was one little anecdote that I wanted to remind people of. When a Wall Street Journal reporter asked Prime Minister Cameron why, given this summit, was he meeting with the Prime Minister of Malaysia, you know, for a trade conference the next week? And Cameron responded with ruffled feathers, you know, that this was an inappropriate, almost as though it was an inappropriate question. And what does that have to do with this? And of course, we have to continue with trade. Well, you know, we all since then have learned the extent of the corruption of that prime minister and the kind of grand larceny from his country. And so, you know, there was a sense in which I think even these ambitious commitments were circumscribed and sort of warded off a lot of the more systemic features of how corruption really operates, the kind of networked nature of between public and private sector and between developing and developed world. And then what you had was a gargantuan public demand on corruption that was manifested in the form of uprisings all around the world. And as I say, I really see the populist vote, including Brexit and the Trump vote, as a kind of indignant reaction to corruption, as illogical as that may sound. And so for me, I don't see Cameron losing office and and Obama losing office as a separate external political event, but rather I see them as having been swept away by the very same tsunami of indignation at corruption around the world that this summit was organized to sort of address. And of course, as is so often the case, the alternatives were worse. I mean, I was looking at people turning to the Taliban in their indignation and anti-corruption. The alternative is worse. So I would say, again, a kind of split aftermath. The attention certainly is significantly heightened, I think, even given the sort of setbacks in implementation that we have discussed. I mean, and we see this in the barrage of corruption stories that are reaching the papers that are really to do with a heightened attention, and heightened attention even to, some of the network elements. So it was interesting to see the scrutiny of some of President Biden's appointments with respect to inappropriate conflicts of interest that I don't think, would have been highlighted as much in the past. I think it's clear that kleptocrats have been reinforced around the world. They've been voted in. In particular, because of the way the so-called populists have instrumentalized corruption, you have the whole issue of corruption now being mired in partisanship, so that people from one party only have eyes for the corruption of the other party and are absolutely blind to it at home. And that could be fatal to, I mean, the only thing in my view that really holds out hope for significant advance against corruption is if ordinary people across all of the identity divides, including the political divide, can be welded together in their demand. And then finally, I would say, well, just a couple more down points. Trump actively promoted corruption. There's just no other way to look at his international behavior. And so that obviously had a reinforcing effect that, persists, I think, even now. And then there's been the active deployment of corruption by some international actors in what's coming to be called strategic corruption, the sort of deliberate buying off of leading figures and leading institutions in traditionally anti-corruption type countries like the UK and the US. And I'd just like to finish up with a concern that I have even on the positive developments that we have been seeing, the reinforcement and consolidation of an anti-corruption kind of momentum, at least on the part of civil society and at least on the part of consciousness raising, is that I think that we still prefer to see this as a problem that is fundamentally over there, right? Our favorite villains are the, colorful characters from places like Kazakhstan, right? Or name your African country. And yes, we're getting more and more effective and I want to say conscientious about identifying the Western so-called enablers, right? But that's still circumscribes our guilt, if you will, to specific professions, right? The bankers, the real estate agents, the registered agents, the art dealers, things like that. We can sort of keep our, I want to say, Western developed world guilt a little bit circumscribed. And then you have the occasional aberration where a politician is filling his or her pockets. I would urge us, let's not kid ourselves, right? Our own systems, and this is what I discovered over the last couple of years, are structured in ways that mirror in remarkable dimensions the structures of kleptocratic systems in the developing world. And that goes everywhere from, networks funneling public money as Jameela talked about, the public procurement side of the commitments, to the network rather than in benefit of the public interest, intertwining personnel, and rules, institutions, and agencies that are bent to serve the purposes of the kind of grasping networks rather than the public interest. And I would like to finish with the caution that it is too easy and very comfortable, at least in the United States, to say it was Trump. Yes, Trump was a big aberration whose whole administration was structured this way. That is not what I found. And I find, in spite of the Biden administration's kind of, democracy summit and talk in the direction of anti-corruption, anti-kleptocracy, the way it itself is structured does not break significantly with this past practice. And so back to the beginning, if systemic corruption drives its society toward serious crisis, I'm afraid that we're still kind of on the tracks, aiming at some pretty severe calamities. I'm not sure we've done enough to adjust that trajectory.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thanks, everybody. Fantastic set of interventions to kick us off. So we're going to open up to questions in a minute. If you would like to ask a question, please use the raise your hand function in Zoom. It's down at the bottom of the screen under reactions. If you're shy or don't have a microphone, then you're also welcome to type your question in the chat. But I always think it's quite nice to come to people and have people actually speak if they want to. So do start thinking about your questions and put your hand up if you have a question. I'm just going to abuse my position though, abuse of power, we know all about that. And I wanted to just ask the panelists, many of you raised the issue that there's this lack of global leadership. David Cameron exited very soon. There doesn't really seem to be anyone particularly saying, I'm going to take on that mantle. Do you see that there is a source of global leadership on this? If so, where's it coming from countries or individuals? And what would it take to try and regain the momentum that we had 5 years ago? So I'm just going to go to the panelists in the same order as before. So if we start with Creon, any thoughts on that? Where's the leadership coming from?
Thanks very much. So I was listening to the other panelists, and I mean, it seems to me there is the US is a possibility. There's the EU, and then I also want to make the case that it may well be in the private sector. Just on the US, I think everything Sarah says, she's much more expert. I think the critical test is going to be beneficial ownership transparency. This was one area where many parts of the US system, including under Trump, were just embarrassed by the position the US takes. If there was a change there, it would be a big factor. Given the state from which President Biden comes, it's probably very unlikely. And I think if there isn't a change in that area of beneficial ownership transparency, it's hard to see more broadly the US being a leader internationally. The EU, I do think, is really interesting in a sense because it has, if you like, the bureaucratic mechanisms, the bureaucratic systems, a very strong lobby group in the parliament for fighting corruption. And I think, this goes to broader questions of global governance and the role the EU plays and so on. I think this is not impossible that the EU could become a major promoter of anti-corruption efforts in the future. But the final thought I just wanted to say was, we can see in the low carbon transition and climate change, the enormous role that is being played by assessments of climate risk in private sector financial flows in driving the low carbon transition. And in ESG, you also have, if you like, the potential for a really serious focus on corruption. I don't know that it's there yet, but if you could see, in a way, the defunding of things that are linked to corruption becoming a really major factor in the way private sector financial markets work, in the way that has already become in climate change. So that would be the area to watch from my point of view.
Thank you. Jameela?
Yeah, I think second Creon's point about the private sector, I think that's really exciting and a major space that we haven't yet as a field necessarily tapped into very well, to be honest. I'd be wary of looking to any single jurisdiction for leadership at the moment. Just picking up on one of my last points, I think that is too short term an approach. And I think we get in a kind of one step forward, two step back. I think that rhythm doesn't really do our long-term effort any justice. Yeah, and I wouldn't want to put too many eggs in one basket. So I think that it's an all hands on deck effort, basically, and everybody needs to up their game. And I think that the more international institutions, organizations, the international development banks, all sorts of organizations can really step up and change their expectations of who they work with and how they work with them. For example, the IMF in the pandemic requiring beneficial ownership information to come through as part of their assistance, I think was a major thing. And I think it's those sort of requirements that organizations and institutions can embed that will be quite transformational in everything that we do. So yeah, no individual leader, all hands on deck.
Great stuff. Thanks, Jameela. And then Robert.
Thank you. I mean, not wanting to be contrarian, but I'm not sure I see leadership either coming from or able to come from the private sector. I think this is a massive global political issue, and in the way that, although companies have played a very important role in climate change, let's not forget it was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, sponsored by governments, and then a governmental process, the UN Convention on Climate Change, that really pushed this for a number of years before companies and investors were forced really to react to that environment that was being set by the governmental processes. So I think this has to be a matter of political will, and you then have a look around, which jurisdictions is that likely to come from, notwithstanding Jameela's point that they're only, if they're a democracy, they're only in power for 4 or 5 years, and that's an inherent flaw. It's clearly not going to come from the UK. I think we can be pretty clear about that. Quite apart from the issues of political distraction of Brexit and other things, there isn't any sense of leadership on this issue from the current government, and I think one would have had the signals already if that was likely to be going to happen. Creon talked about this potentially being a bridging issue, as climate change is between states with aligned interests, even if they might differ politically on other areas. I'm not sure I see that, actually. China is the elephant in the room, and China has been not aligned on this issue. China has, to some extent, used corruption strategically, as Sarah was mentioning, states do. China's dominance in many African markets, in Asia, has been strongly aligned to the willingness of Chinese companies not to play by the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention rulebook. And it's no coincidence that China isn't a member of that convention. So I'm not sure I see that alignment, and therefore a bridging issue. So you then come down to, is it the EU or is it the US? The EU, I think, possibly one might see individual member states with some political will, but nobody's hugely demonstrated that to date. And collectively, I'm not sure I see the EU doing that. It's generally not been very good at taking global leadership on lots of these kind of issues, and so I'm not sure why it would do so on corruption. So then you, of course, by default almost come back to the US. And I think there was a sense that when the Biden administration came in, maybe it would give this a high priority. I think that looks less likely now than it did perhaps 4 or 5 months ago, which is a shame. It's not too late. But on the other hand, if you're a 4-year term president, it becomes too late quite rapidly. Maybe that has missed the boat. Just back on Europe then, individual member states, I would wonder whether, by the way, Germany has always been remarkably lacking on this issue, as it has on so many global issues in terms of leadership. France, I wonder. France is always, in UK parliamentary debates, France is always seen as the big enemy in terms of corruption. My goodness, aren't the French terrible? Look at all the things they do. But France actually, it has a new law, just as the UK had the Bribery Act, the Loi Sapin-II. It has a new anti-corruption agency. There has been a sense of some political leadership. And certainly, I think, in some of the international forums, France has been making sort of its presence felt more strongly on this issue than it had ever before. So that is a possibility, I think. But, that's slightly clutching at straws. So, I guess my conclusion is that you do need political leadership, but I don't see it coming from anywhere in the immediate future, though it's never too late for somebody to step up.
Okay, thank you. And Sarah?
I would just say that I'm also a bit skeptical, partly because, again, just to cast light on the shadows, we're not, the UK isn't an actor, right? The EU isn't an actor. People are actors. And then it turns out that almost everyone in a kind of political position is deeply enmeshed in corrupt networks, understanding it, a little bit more broadly than is typically the case. But I don't need to dwell on the Hunter Biden episode, where I was unable to get anyone in the US focused good governance community to be willing even to say publicly that while the specific allegations in some cases were false, the reality of that situation was absolutely unacceptable. There is no way you can say that this is a perfectly acceptable relationship between a vice president and his son and a massively corrupt foreign, entity. And so I'm given pause by the degree to which there's a sort of soft enabling ecosystem that is much vaster than I had really understood even a year or two ago. And therefore, I turn back, almost ironically, Robert is looking to governments and I'm looking to civil society. And by that, I do mean organized civil society. And I really think that tremendous progress and articulation and consolidation has taken place over the last little while. But I also believe that without mass mobilization, we're not going to get very far. And mass mobilization needs to cross the divides, and it needs to have a little bit of staying power, not just be a sort of off with their head reaction, which it typically has been. And I'm not sure that organized civil society, which has been so focused on, kind of specific legislative or regulatory changes and working with kind of specialists, anti-corruption specialists in the field, really has develop the techniques for mass mobilization and for channeling mass mobilization in as constructive a form over time as possible.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, let's hear from the audience. So I'm going to take a group of 4 questions from the first 4 people who've raised their hands, and then I'm going to give all the panelists a chance to comment on those, and then we'll do a second round in which I will also read out some from the chat. So when I'm going to come to you first, Juliet, then Ewan, then Sappho, then Patrick. If you could just briefly introduce yourself, and then also just to try and keep the questions and comments fairly brief so that we have got plenty of chance for other people to ask questions. So Juliet.
Hi. Good day, and thank you to the speakers. That was brilliant. So my name is Juliet Ibeka-Fumago. As I work currently as an advisor to the President on anti-corruption and asset recovery matters, and I participated in the summit, working closely with the government of Nigeria. From my view, I just have a few questions. When Creon talked about bridge between the West and China, my first question was, where do you live, or where does this developing country stand in between the two? Because you can't leave developing countries out of this discussion, given that most of the illicit funds and illicit financial flows. When you track it, you find that these monies are moving from developing countries to the West. And that takes me to the issue of leadership. The conversation about leadership is very interesting. Are we going to be able to find leadership in anti-corruption or the actors that exist within the sector? That's a very difficult question. And therefore, I see that in the long time, it's going to remain diverse. And that diversity may be really what we need, whether we talk about civil society or the international actors, or we talk about the different governments that exist. I do personally do not see it lying anywhere else. And quickly, let me just add in terms of what Sarah said. This really, for me, the networks that exist between the private sector and the public sector, developing countries and developed countries, in terms of, again, I go back to the movement of illicit funds. How do we manage the offshore financial centers, for example? What do we do with that? Because that's part of the network. Networks created by financial institutions that are supposed to be leading in terms of ensuring that these funds do not really get into their system in the first place. And how do we encourage sustainable approach to recovering these funds back to the countries of origin, in line with the UN Convention? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juliet. Next up is Ewan.
Yeah, can you hear me? I've unmuted.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm the former intelligence analyst for transnational organized crime and the ex-Soviet states in the UK Customs Service. I very much like Mr. Butler's comment, although I'm actually a little more optimistic. Give his comment about President Biden, of course, being the former senior senator for Delaware. I think that might actually be a bit of a boost to him. My question is, and it follows on from the lady's comment about the developing countries, is do the Western countries collectively and individually and as a group, G7, possibly extension of G10, have a plan B for geopolitics coming in with a vengeance, particularly in economies crucial to the new economy and combating climate change, given that the US Corporate Transparency Act may well lead to and beneficial ownership developments lead to a move from Western link, particularly UK Crown dependencies, to sovereign states, Dubai, Singapore come to mind, and the Indian Ocean states, who frankly are key players of geopolitical influence. There's a limit to how much the West can put on Dubai, because Dubai is on the Strait of Hormuz, and it's not that far from the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and China's got a naval base in Djibouti. So are we planning plan B and plan Z for when the Chinese whip hand is stronger than it is now? And also they're moving towards digital currencies and perhaps to circumvent the dollar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ewan. Sappho.
Thank you. So first of all, just want to say thank you for organising this event. I found it so enlightening. Just a question to, am I allowed to ask a question to Sarah directly? I just wondered if you could unpick a bit your comment on strategic corruption by international actors. Oh, I realise I've not said who I am. I'm Sappho Xenakis. I'm a reader in criminology and international relations for Birkbeck, University of London. I was just too excited to ask my question. So strategic corruption by international actors becoming involved, as I understand it, in compromising anti-corruption efforts in countries like the UK and the US. So my question is, first, can you unpick that a bit? Second question, do you have anything written on this? Third, what are you drawing on for this? Anything that you could suggest would be really helpful. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And then Patrick.
Hello, can you hear me? I'm Patrick Winter. I work for The Guardian. In fact, I was at the in Singapore with David Cameron when he made that speech and covered the anti-corruption summit, and just generally thought it was, you know, the high point of the Cameron government, and followed by the low point very soon afterwards. My one was a point and the other was a question. My point was that if you read Samantha Power, who's now obviously inside the government in America in Foreign Affairs in January, she highlights corruption as one of the big three issues that Biden could take up in the context of his democracy summit as a means of renewing democracy, and also it's being a branch of the challenge to China. Though I very much take all the points about don't put all your eggs in the basket of one or two individuals, it seems to me you do need to have some big player involved and enthusiastic. And if there is someone like Samantha Power who's, you know, expressed this enthusiasm for the subject, it seems to be foolish not to sort of try to hitch onto her to a degree. And my question really was, why did you think the UK sort of dropped the ball on corruption after the summit? Was it just to Theresa May's personal antagonism towards another Conservative leader's agenda? It just seems so strange. You've had the machine behind, the Whitehall machine behind this process. It's been successful, and it's quite difficult to get a kind of unique international calling card on an issue. And you felt the British government had achieved that. I was just wondering why it all fell by the wayside so terribly.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to go to the panelists in reverse order this time. So we're going to start with Sarah, then Robert, then Jameela, and then Creon. And please, you know, answer whichever questions take your fancy. I just hope that we get them all covered by all of the panel. So Sarah, if we could start with you.
Sure. I would like to, you know, in the interest of brevity, I'll focus on the question that was directed at me, but just to say I do utterly agree with the enforcement point, and fundamentally with Jameela's point in terms of leadership, which is all hands on deck. I mean, that's kind of what I was trying to drive at. But there is a lot that can be done. We're in the, again, US perspective in the process of quote, rethinking the police or reimagining the police. And I'm like, okay, some police need to be defunded, but some police need to be refunded. And that really is the corporate crime and corruption, police prosecution, you know, at every level. I think that there's a really significant amount of progress, both in terms of internal fight against corruption and external, that can be done by way of guidance within administrations and, you know, and things like that. So on strategic corruption, in particular, the culprits that are being highlighted are China and Russia. And what I mean, it's not just that they're targeting anti-corruption efforts specifically, they are targeting potential champions by basically buying them off. So what you see at the moment is a huge campaign of both investment and donations. So there are a number of us who have been kind of raising our shields against the donations provided by various Russian oligarchs. You know, I mean, Len Blavatnik to Oxford University, for example, the Len Blavatnik School of Government. Again, domestically, Charles Koch, who I see as being kind of the central private sector figure in the most powerful US kleptocratic networks, is now spraying his money around all of these, you know, left-leaning and supposedly good governance and anti-corruption type organizations. And so it's a kind of image laundering that instills a sort of, I want to say almost self-censorship or self-limitation on the organizations that take this money. And that goes for individuals and whatnot. And so as for written material, you can look at the work of Ilya Zaslavsky, Zaslavsky, and also there was an article really titled for this phenomenon in the American interest. I think in the last, I think it's called strategic corruption. If you Google strategic corruption, the American interest in the last year, certainly.
Great, thank you. Robert, your responses.
Thank you. I'm going to respond to several of those in a sort of general rambling way. So, I mean, first off, Juliet, the things I take from what she was mentioning, first off, a point that Frank Vogel has also made in the chat about the importance of the victims of corruption in this, and how tackling corruption easily becomes a very sort of technocratic subject. But in fact, I think one of the things that was very present for me in the summit was the sense that there are real victims here. And that, again, I think was quite a step forward in the way the UK was dealing with this issue in the summit. And obviously asset recovery relates to that. If you get money back from the kleptocrats, you can give it back to the victims if you can either identify them or give them back to a state without them being the assets being stolen again. But I think asset recovery is a possible sort of way forward on some of these slightly technical issues, actually. In that I think although it's quite hard to do in some ways, in some of the technical ways, I think politically it's a bit easier. Because once you've confiscated some assets or recovered the assets, then if you give them back, you're actually building a relationship with the country you're giving them back to. So it has that useful political diplomatic dimension as well. So, I think there is more to be done about that, not just because it helps restitution for the victims, but because I think it's a politically more achievable thing. What I take from Ewan's points is a question that also came out from what Creon was saying, in a slight sense of if we had the summit today, it would be covering very different issues. And we've got to be aware that by banging on about things that came out of the summit, still now 5 years later, like beneficial ownership transparency, important though those things are, that we don't find that we're suddenly addressing yesterday's problems. That we've got to address today's problems. And 5 years on, there are a different set of problems to do with some of the things Creon mentioned, the change in global geopolitical dynamics, the change of vast move towards populism and so on. That is what I take from what Ewan was saying. Patrick's very important question, why did the UK drop the ball? I mean, I think the main answer to this is simply the political distraction of Brexit. But I think it's also important to say that that doesn't explain why the UK would permanently drop the ball. And, albeit Cameron had an unusual sort of push on these issues for a government, the UK is now, really way behind where it was in terms of leadership. And I don't think that's entirely explained by Brexit. I cast my mind back to the financial crisis in 2008, when the UK introduced its golden visa regime. And there was research done by TI shortly after that, which saw that 60% of the visas, unchecked, no real due diligence, went to citizens of Russia and China. And that was, deliberate policy, not to promote corruption, but to get inward investment at a time when the economy was in trouble. And the truth is that post-Brexit and post-COVID, the UK economy is likely to have a pretty rough ride. I think we can all see that. And so you can see why the government would not want to close off avenues that bring inward investment to the UK, that allow the UK to export to new markets where levels of corruption are very high. So, you'll never hear the government explicitly say that intention. But there is a real politic to this, I think, which is about the economic side of things and the UK's current position. And that certainly was the case in 2008 and, that golden visa regime. So one might see parallels. And just finally, on the point of strategic corruption, Sappho's question, in addition to the links that Sarah's highlighted, there are a couple of other things I can send you, Sappho, if you give us your email address. One of them is actually from TI, which has a defense and security program, and have done some very good work on what they call the weaponization of corruption, which is very similar to the work on strategic corruption. So I think this is an emerging field, is the way in which states are using corruption. They're not simply fighting corruption, they're using it in order to promote themselves or do down their enemies.
Brilliant. Thanks, Robert. Jameela.
Thank you. I'm going to respond to Patrick's question, and Robert's already touched on it, but I do think that that kind of shift in political attention immediately after the summit is a major reason why we weren't able to sustain attention and, you know, momentum at that level on anti-corruption. I also think that we maybe lost a bit of credibility in the international framing on these kind of big global issues as we started to shift and, you know, change, and, you know, things started to get a bit more rocky here. And so I do know that the UK actually delivered on most of its commitments, just to go back to that very technical point, pretty quickly, and think, you know, real progress was made in the immediate time after on some quite transformational initiatives. But I do think that they decided to, from what I understand, quite rightly step back from being the visible champions of anti-corruption in the world because of that credibility issue, and really focus more on leading from behind and offering technical support and working really closely with civil society across the world and funding important projects like the one that I led at Transparency International to keep up that accountability and keep the momentum of the summit going behind the scenes. So drop the ball in that kind of visible leader way, potentially, but I do think that the momentum and the ambition and the concentration of efforts was still there behind the scenes.
Great. And over to Creon.
Thanks very much, Liz. I mean, some really great questions. So I'll just pick a few to respond to. I mean, the first question about the role of developing countries, I think, I mean, you're absolutely right. Developing countries are critically important. And the sort of pillar for the anti-corruption summit was very much the kind of Paul Collier view that, you know, we shouldn't be preaching to developing countries. We should actually be facilitating what many of them wanted to do in any case. So I hold by that. My point really was to say that, you know, in terms of the infrastructure that supports corruption elsewhere, can the West and China unite in tackling that or not? There was, you know, that period when I was co-chairing the anti-corruption working group with China, and there were elements which were consistent with that and some that certainly weren't. The only other thing I'll just say about China is that much of the research says that, you know, one should not look at the Chinese system as having one single view. So there will be elements who may well be willing to consider, you know, use of corruption in the sort of strategic sense, but there'll be others in the sort of financial sector who will be very worried about what it may mean for, you know, the stability of the financial system, the risk to the foreign exchange reserves, and so on. So I think it's a really complicated picture. Just on offshore centers, and whether there could be sort of alternative offshore centers with a very different constitutional background to the sort of overseas territories. I mean, when I looked into this in some depth, and we were putting real pressure on BVI and others in this respect, the thing I concluded actually is that there is a kind of unique combination of, if you like, the British rule of law that comes from being an overseas territory, and, you know, the ability to be a center for offshore funds. And I just don't think you can replicate that elsewhere. And that's why, in a sense, I felt much more confident in sort of pushing hard to say, look, you know, you can't afford to sort of just go independent, because, you know, the whole basis of your financial system will go with it. So I would question whether or not, you know, that is a viable model as an alternative to the overseas territories, or whether they are actually kind of unique in that respect. On the sort of follow through and why we didn't maintain the momentum we had. I mean, to be fair to Theresa May, she went to the G20 summit in the same year, in 2016, and she very much did carry through, you know, what was required in relation to the David Cameron summit in that G20. I mean, I just think that, you know, when I said she had other priorities, you know, there is only so much bandwidth as a country that's not a president of an event that you can actually use. So if you're in a G20 platform and you want to push for something, you can't have 5 different things. So if Theresa May had wanted to have modern slavery, for example, as her priority, there's a limit to which you can do that and do other things. And so, you know, it's obviously a question one should put to her, but I think there is that that constraint. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. So in a second, I'm going to come to the next three people with their hand up, who are Sankita, John and Chitu. But I also just wanted to first ask Duncan Haynes to speak, because Duncan did have a question in the chat, but also as Policy Director at Transparency International UK at the moment, I wonder, Duncan, if you might also just interject a couple of comments in terms of how you see things from your perspective.
Thank you, Liz. That's very kind. I think we've heard David Cameron say that Britain's experience in Afghanistan, and indeed Sarah's writings at the time, was part of his inspiration for the summit. And if there's anything we've learned in the 5 years since, I think it is absolutely about corruption not just being a problem for them over there, but rather that it is an Achilles heel for the club of democracies that is one of the alliances that Joe Biden is looking to restore. And so the opportunity, as people are looking to his administration for some leadership now on this issue, and the summit and the plans for it, and what was said earlier about Samantha Power and her insights into this, is to not just have a conversation about corruption, the one that politicians find comfortable having, about it being something that happens over there. But as America kind of reflects on its own democratic challenges in light of the Trump experience, in light of January the 6th, to have the courage to have the more difficult conversation, which is about how corruption is our problem here. And indeed, we probably are never going to be able to persuade the FSB or other hostile international actors to not use corruption in their own warped form of statecraft. But we ought to be able to persuade ourselves to take the actions we need to take to prevent corruption being our vulnerability. So that is the analysis today from TI, which was behind my question, which I put in the chat, and where our hopes are for the forthcoming Summit for Democracy, which I see as the passing on of the baton from what Robert, Jameela, Creon and David Cameron began 5 years ago.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Duncan. So Sankita, what's your question?
Hi, thanks, Liz. So I'll start with a short comment and go on to a question.
If you could just quickly introduce yourself, Sankita.
My name is Sankita Gunrathan. I'm Deputy Executive Director at Transparency International Sri Lanka, a former student of Liz and Robert both at the Sussex Centre for Study of Corruption as well. Just getting right into it. So for me, the summit denotes an acknowledgement, a grand big acknowledgement on the UK's part that it was on the corruption spectrum as well, both as a destination country and as a facilitator of corruption by way of whether it's professional networks or through the crown dependencies or overseas territories. So that was quite refreshing, that it was a loud acknowledgement of that. And it has also led the way for countries like ours, like Sri Lanka, to look to and learn from. So, commenting on the summit itself for countries like ours, it did lead to very unsubstantial commitments. For example, Sri Lanka committed to implementing UNCAC, which is all of it. And so it is left to organizations like TI to advocate on the basis of these pledges. And that leads to really my question about follow-up, right? So whether follow-up was thought enough about in the design of the summit, and what lessons we can learn from that for any future events, whether it's US-led or whether it is UNGAS that is just in the offing right now, less than a month to go. So can we build such elements into the design of such an event? And that brings me to my third point about international accountability for countries that have domestic violations. So the UNCAC process and even UNGAS revolves around all these political commitments and the lowest common denominator, if you will. So in that kind of context, you don't really see threats of sanctions or any resolutions being passed against countries that violate, that have massive or atrocious corruption violations. So I feel like we don't talk about the problem enough. There is a conversation about a criminal court, but in a political sense, there is very little pushback on countries that are manifestly corrupt sometimes within the international community. So it is, I think, important, especially in contexts where there may be state capture and where populist governments may have been elected, and where domestic accountability is failing, for that kind of political, for us or the anti-corruption community to push for political accountability. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Sankita. John.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks, Liz. My name is John Heavenshaw. I'm Professor of International Relations at University of Exeter, and I'm Principal Investigator on a global integrity-run anti-corruption evidence project, which looks at questions of beneficial ownership. So, unsurprisingly, my question is in that area. Just to comment first that I really appreciate the TI tracker. If you actually look at it for the UK, it shows that 44% of the commitments made 5 years ago are overdue, including the public registry of beneficial ownership of foreign companies owning UK property, which we were yet again promised in the Queen's speech yesterday. So please, let's all of us keep following that, because that's important. And then my question really was the one I put in the comment, which was unexplained wealth orders. We've had the rather absurd situation of an English judge affirming the evidence provided to the court through Mishcon de Reya, one of those wonderful London law firms that are so crucial in making sure these things don't succeed, that evidence provided by Kazakhstan about the president's daughter is considered to be valid and reliable in an English court. Now, if we're generating common law and precedent through processes like this, which basically involve English judges affirming evidence generated through the principle of kleptocracy, then we'd be better off not introducing those measures in the first place, quite frankly. So my question is simply, can this instrument be redeemed? Can it in any way be recovered and used effectively? You know, some of the cases have been effective, but they've been low-hanging fruit cases. And if it's going to be effective at addressing kleptocracy, which is the big issue here, and it's the issue that Cameron himself raised, that subsequent UK government ministers explicitly referred to with regard to UWOs, then it's got to be able to get at incumbents, not at people who've fallen out of favour with their home countries. And therefore, those countries are very willing to provide the quote unquote evidence to support that prosecution. So can we get around that problem? Because if not, it seems to me UWOs should be jettisoned.
Thanks very much, John. And then the last question is from Chitu.
Hello. My name is Chitu Okoli. I'm a professor at Schema Business School in Paris, though I'm originally grew up in Nigeria and in Canada. And I'm not an active corruption researcher. I've just had dabbling interests in it over the years. But I have a question. My primary interest is in the relationship between culture and corruption. And I've always had the sense that there are some cultures, some national cultures, where behaviors that are called corrupt are more acceptable than they are in other cultures. And interestingly, even such countries will often publicly decry corruption, but socially, many of these behaviors are acceptable. However, when I've talked about these ideas with anti-corruption researchers or activists, I often get the reaction that no, there's not a cultural element, because it seems that some people think that saying that kind of contradicts the idea that there could be structural changes that could make changes in the countries. But I just like to your thoughts on that idea that there is a cultural element where corruption behaviors are more acceptable in certain cultures. And the reason why I'm interested in that is that I have the sense that if that is not recognized, then it's really a losing battle, because if it's a matter of trying to address harmful elements within some cultures, then there are strategies that could try to alleviate those, whereas a lot of anti-corruption measures try to make structural changes, but structural changes that do not address underlying culture, whether good or bad, are unsurprisingly decade after decade doomed for failure. So
okay. Thank you very much, Chitu. So that's a tough job for panelists. You've got 90 seconds each to tackle those brilliant questions. And I'm going to go back to the original order. So we'll start with Creon.
Thanks very much. Well, if I could just start with the first question on culture. Again, this was a strong theme from Paul Collier, and there was an idea which we didn't go with, but I was a real fan of, which was, I mean, what Paul Collier said was that what you need to create is a community of officials around the world with a high level of integrity, and the way you do that is by, if you like, mixing people working in emerging markets or developing economies with people working in advanced economies, and give them a common ethos. You know, that to me struck very true. I mean, whenever doing technical assistance, very often what developing countries want is not consultants. They want real officials who are currently working on debt management or treasury management, whatever, and to go out. So the idea was, let's increase the British civil service by 1 or 2% and have a cadre of people who spend, you know, X% of their career in emerging economies, and they, you know, take their expertise there and then they bring it back and give a whole sort of different perspective to the way the civil service is run. Unfortunately, Jeremy Hayward didn't buy this, I'm afraid, but it's a great idea and it may yet come to bear. But I think it goes to the point, culture is really important. Secondly, just on the issue of beneficial ownership, I mean, I don't think Robert was saying this, but even though it's an old issue, I think it is still an absolutely crucial current issue. It is I mean, we saw it as a golden key at the time of the Anti-Corruption Summit. I still think it's a golden key. And so I remember working with a number of colleagues on that, on how you actually do the registry of beneficial ownership for property in the UK. It was quite complicated, but it really works. It's sitting there waiting to happen. So I just hope that we finally get it through. And then just finally, the point about follow-up. I think there is a ratchet effect in terms of you get people to make commitments, and then in summits by their leaders, you then need to go back and work hard on their systems to make it happen. And I think that was where we fell down. I don't think it was necessarily that the commitments themselves were stretched too far. If we'd had the follow-up, we might have got a lot more of it through. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Creon. Jameela.
Thanks. I'm going to respond to the same question from Sankita, and on the point of, can we build in mechanisms for follow-up and implementation tracking into the design? I think we definitely can. In theory, there's no reason why we can't. But I think it's worth remembering that although we're still talking about it 5 years on, that was like an 8-hour event, which was planned in about 6 months. So it was really quick. It was like a real burst of energy, and it obviously had a lot of impact and meaning, but we didn't take enough time in the planning or have the information we needed to set up the frameworks and do what we need to do to really hit the ground running with the tracking and the follow-up. I'd also make the point, which might feel obvious, but is important to say, is that implementation is only really doable with a strong civil society and a government that's willing to be tracked and is willing to offer information and be open with the information that we're trying to ask about. We hit many walls in the first few months and years in trying to get that essential information that they publicly said that they do. And so that made our work incredibly difficult, and I'm sure yours as well, Sankita. So it's just worth acknowledging that it doesn't just happen. It requires a lot of different elements to really work together in harmony, and not every country has that.
Thanks. Robert?
Thank you. I'll try and address 2 or 3 of those. The first on unexplained wealth orders from John. I think they're on the cusp of failing as an anti-corruption tool. You know, I do think there's a severe problem here, and you're highlighting that. When they were introduced, they were slightly gate crashed by the law enforcement community, who also saw how useful they would be against organized crime. So I think they'll continue as a tool there domestically in the UK. But for kleptocracy, grand corruption, the jury is definitely out. And I think part of that is about cost protection for the law enforcement agencies, And part of it is about the resources given to law enforcement agencies in the UK. So, that's something that could go some way towards being able to fight off a law firm like Mishcon de Reya, for example, if that arises again. On the culture point, there's a long-running debate about this, which we can't deal with in 10 seconds. But I would just say there is a difference between what is common practice and what is genuinely culturally acceptable. And when TI went out and looked at the Global Corruption Barometer and what the victims of corruption in all countries around the world were saying about it, they didn't like it. And nobody around the world who is a victim of corruption likes corruption, and there are more victims than there are perpetrators. So let's not forget that. And finally, I just want to finish on picking up something that Sarah said at the beginning. Although I'm slightly pessimistic about the political will to take this fight forward in the next few years, I do think that a lot, therefore, rests on the shoulders of civil society. And that remains a great strength of lots of countries, a reinvigorated civil society on this in the US. We saw during the Trump administration, strong civil society in the UK and, burgeoning civil society in lots of countries like Nigeria and India. So, I think there is a huge potential here. Maybe the time has come that we'll see greater sort of energy and leadership from civil society, even greater than we've seen before.
Thanks very much. And Sarah, over to you.
Just to reiterate what Robert said on culture, that one obviously got a rise out of us. And I would agree, I have never, ever, I did not take up this whole issue because I was interested in it. It was ordinary Afghans who, to them, it was the single most important issue in their lives. And so make a distinction between the survival strategies of people who are subjected to a systemic situation. The only way they can make their lives in that kind of a situation is to, deal with, is to basically pay the bribe, if you will, or use it, use it for that extra little bit of getting ahead. And I would just say again, not that this is a uniquely Western issue, but the kind of political economies of most developing countries were established largely in the 19th century by an industrialized world that was deeply in the grips of systemic corruption itself at that time. In the late 19th century, that is how every system of government, every country with diverse systems of government in Europe and the United States was essentially structured. And so that's the, there's a lot of poison pills that got left behind with colonialism, but that's a big one because it has had a lasting impact. And so when you talk about culture, there you're looking at 150 years at least. That's a long time. I mean, people do adapt to local situations over that kind of time, but that doesn't mean they like it or that they embrace it as their own, with some, distinctions in terms sometimes of nepotism. I think, there are conflicting priorities that are genuine priorities that I think culturally do act against an anti-corruption impulse. And then I'm going to do something weird and answer the questions that Duncan did not in fact ask. So Duncan, you said that your question was in chat, but I think it was, what would be ambitious enough? Is that right? I mean, again, boy, I am the least constructive. I'm thoughtful, but not very constructive here. Serious ethics commitments on the home front. And I fear that the Biden administration has already failed there. In other words, what is called the revolving door is in fact how networks weave themselves across the public and private sector. It's not an individual pushing a revolving door between business and government. It's in fact a network that is temporarily placing some of its members in government office long enough for them to protect the network, and then they come back and cash out in the private sector. I don't see that the Biden administration, is really going to lead on that. I do think that significant commitments on enforcement would make a big difference. That would be new. If you had quantifiable commitments in terms of budget and personnel that would be devoted to enforcement. And I utterly agree with the comment about incumbents. You know, all of our anti-corruption agencies and operations have essentially gone with low-hanging fruit for whom there was evidence. I mean, what drove enforcement action was quality of evidence, not importance of perpetrator. And I don't know how, again, that requires very persistent, courageous guidance from the leadership of these organizations to reward efforts aimed at significant perpetrators, even if cases are lost. You know, whereas if you're totting up cases won, then you're going to go for the winnable cases. And finally, to refrain from politicizing this issue. And I think that may be, again, like a wish too far, but this means that both abroad and at home, I think there's a tendency, you know, in bilateral or multilateral relationships to crack down on corruption, you know, again, from an American perspective, when it's Venezuela, but not crack down on corruption when it's Honduras, you know. Some countries' corruption stinks worse than others, and some countries get a pass on their corruption when there are so-called political trade-offs, which very often are trade-offs on behavior. I mean, the corrupt behavior is precisely what is generating the issue upon which we want quote unquote cooperation, be that fighting the Taliban or be it, you know, halting migration. And at home also. I mean, it means that our political leadership has to have the courage to hold its own side to account. And I don't know how you make that a commitment at a summit, but that's the kind of ambition I'm talking about. And Duncan, we can talk about how Trump actively promoted kleptocracy, but it's, I mean, in a word, it's Ukraine. I mean, I was working in Afghanistan when we didn't have what we might call top cover, and I immediately saw that it was hopeless. I mean, immediately, shortly, it was pretty clear that because the networks are vertically integrated, if you don't have backup at the highest level of government to take on a network like that, you are not gonna be able to do so. Well, how much worse is it when, you know, the president of the United States is sanctioning publicly the one ambassador who actually takes this issue seriously? That's the message that kleptocrats read. You don't have to write a communique saying I'm in favor of corruption. You act in that way, and kleptocrats read your body language, if you will. And that is, and the other piece of body language is entering into personal deals with a bunch of these guys. Right? I mean, you got the president of the United States begging you for, you know, help, you know, authorizing his hotel in thus and such a place. So those are the ways, but I don't really want to end on that. Just that I'd like to end on Jameela's point. This is an all hands on deck situation. Each one of us, with our varied and often unexpected talents and quirks and foibles and abilities and dislikes and whatever, we are needed in this fight. And this fight is, in my view, the most significant challenge facing our generation, because so many other crises are driven by it.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you, everybody. Thanks. This has been a fantastic conversation. We've run over and pretty much everyone has stayed with us. And I think that's really testament to what fantastic speakers we have, and also what a brilliant audience with some really insightful and interesting and provocative and tough questions. So it's been a fantastic conversation. In normal times, I think we would now go to another room, have a glass of something bubbly and continue the conversation. And I'm really sad that we can't do that. But on the other hand, we did manage to have lots of people from different countries in the room, which has been really fantastic. And I hope that we will be doing more events like this in the near future, perhaps even in person. And definitely we'll be back for 10 years after the summit in 5 years' time and see how things are looking then. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. We will sign off now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Liz.
Bye-bye.